this computer. Right.
Okay. I'm going to get rid of as many of these bits as I can. Okay. So shall I start sharing the presentation? I think you've said enough about me, really. I mean, it's I'll say a bit more in the course of the presentation, but um, let's start the actual slide, shall we? And then from the beginning. Okay. Oh, now I need to get rid of this. Okay. I think that's done it. Great. Well, to start to say thanks very much for inviting me to speak. Um, and as I was preparing for the talk, I was sort of thinking about all the things people have said about themselves and the similarities and differences in the experiences we've shared. And I wondered if there is actually something going on that we're all experiencing, but in our own ways, so that it can look very different. So in this talk, I want to try and answer that question, partly using my own experience and how I've tried to make sense of that. Um, and I also want to look at whether something similar might be going on for humanity as a whole. So I'll talk for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for discussion. So for me, this journey brings three areas together: Kundalini, psychedelics, and trauma. And I've drawn mostly on Jungian psychology and something called the law of three. And I'll tell you more about what that means later on. I've also looked at the more systemic thinking of Cynthia Bourgeault and Irvin Laszlo. But to give a little bit of context, I'll start with some key experiences in my own life. And I'm not going to talk through this in great detail. It's just to say that I had some early operations as a child, so that left me with some anxious attachment patterns. I've always needed there to be something more than just material reality. Um, I trained in counseling and social work. And then in 97 was the my first experience really of this, there being other levels of reality that we can connect with through in that case it was holotropic breath work, and that's also the first time that I experienced kundalini energy. I was so bowled over by that that I decided to do the holotropic breathwork training with Stan Groff. So I had a year of doing that and fairly intensive meditation. And then I took a year out in the States. I mean, I was really privileged to be able to do all this. I sold my house to pay for it. I went to the States and had more time with intensive meditation, but also um, use of psychedelics for the first time in my life. And I had a number of really big experiences, some of which I'll tell you about. But of course, eventually my money ran out. So I had to go back home and start work again, first as a mental health advocate and then as a social worker. So I didn't feel like I could be really that open in myself. So I stopped doing all these various practices. The only thing that still gave me experiences of non-ordinary states was at times when the Kundalini was sort of spontaneously active, sometimes for no reason that I could identify, and sometimes triggered by things that were going on in my life. So in 2016, I came back to holotropic breath work. I had another workshop with psychedelics. And then when I retired in 2021, I did a 2-year training with the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, which is, psychedelic therapy. And during those 2 years and most of the subsequent year, um, Kundalini was more or less consistently active. So for an unusually consistent period of time. Around about autumn last year, I started an MSc with the Aleph Trust. And around about the same time, the energy stopped. So I don't know if that was coincidental or if the two things are linked. I definitely took on too much. So I gave up the MSc in January this year. but the energy hasn't come back. And in a way, that's left me feeling a bit inwardly lost, because that was an important part of my life and my sense of direction, if you like. So for me, Kundalini is one way of entering expanded states of consciousness. And other ways, as I said, are holotropic breathwork, meditation, and psychedelics. And all of those occasion a kind of inner process or spiritual emergence and opening to experiences beyond my regular awareness. So I catch glimpses of the depths of the psyche, and sometimes I can feel a kind of deep connection with something other than me. And experiences can be light and beautiful, and they can be absolutely terrifying and dark. I can't will these openings to happen. I can reach out inwardly, but I need something to meet me, and sometimes that just isn't there or not in the same way. So there were long periods of nothing much happening at all, and times of confusion, and at times a lot of fear. And that kind of has been a drive for me to try and understand what's going on. And I felt this deep longing for that connection to something bigger than myself. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on a couple of questions. How can we understand what goes on in these states? Does the theory actually help me understand my own experiences? Are there dangers in opening up to this process? And is there something similar happening with humanity as a whole? So first, a bit of the theory that's in particular Jung has brought to it. So whatever these experiences are, the immediate raw experience is hard to put into words, and maybe our minds can't fully capture it. So theory is never at what it is. It's a way of trying to grapple with it. And people have talked about it in different ways. Like, for instance, these experiences have a dynamic, enlivening, numinous quality, or they can involve a sense of being filled or held by something, or a kind of infusion or possession. And for me, some of these experiences have involved encounters with what seemed like independent beings or centers of consciousness. And the experiences seem to fall into two interpenetrating dimensions, like two sides of a coin, both with a strong emotional component. So, on the one hand, there was a sort of embodied physical, energetic dimension, and on the other side, a more dynamic mental one. Jung, in a seminar in 1932, talks about the more embedded physical, energetic side when he talks about Kundalini. He says Kundalini is an autonomous archetypal process experienced as a direct embodied awareness of an impersonal, independent dimension of being, of non-ego or self. And he says the system of Tantra is a symbolic theory of the psyche, which aligns with what he calls the individuation process, which is an integration of conscious and unconscious parts of ourselves through which we develop a unique identity separate from the crowd and in a conscious relation to the self, the whole of the psyche. In a book that he wrote called Answer to Job, he connects Kundalini with Sophia, the eternal feminine principle, the force of creation or manifestation in material form. Other people have talked about Kundalini as a lived experience of powerful, numinous, subtle spiritual energy that comes out of a surrender to a deep inner process. And it's written in particular a lot about in ancient Hindu and Buddhist tantric texts, but it's really a cross-cultural phenomenon. And it seems like increasingly we are experiencing it in the West, although maybe in slightly different forms from the Eastern descriptions. And there is a debate about whether really properly we should be calling what we're experiencing Kundalini, because that term may be historically and culturally located. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to say Kundalini, partly because I don't know what else to call it. So we don't know if Carl Jung had experiences of Kundalini, but he may have done. He writes things like this: I stagger drunk with fire. I drank fire in this night. I rose up drunk from the sun with a burning countenance, and my head is ablaze. Give me your hand, a human hand, so that you can hold me to the earth with it. For whirling veins of fire swoop me up, and exultant longing tears me towards the zenith. So, talking about such experiences, he says the numinosum, this numinous energy, is a dynamic existence or effect, not caused by an act of will. It seizes and controls the human subject, which is its victim. It's an involuntary condition, whatever its cause may be. So then looking at the mental side of the experience, that can take the form of inner visions, figures, and entities. Jung says, I learned to take seriously every unknown wanderer who personally inhabits the inner world, since they're real because they're effectual. And that begs the question whether we also have an impact on what we encounter. And looking at what he wrote about his own experiences in the Red Book, that seems to suggest that we do. So, how can we make sense of these inner visions and wanderers? So, this diagram is from a book by Bernardo Kastrup, who has written about the metaphysics of Jung. So, Jung says about the psyche as a whole that our ego, or ego consciousness, or our I, is the part of the wider psyche that we identify with and over which we have some control. So that's our everyday functioning self. And he calls that the subjective psyche. That's surrounded by the unconscious, which he calls the objective psyche, which has a personal unconscious part, but the vast amount of it is the collective unconscious, which is an universal, unchanging, archetypal foundation of the psyche. So the psyche really is one continuity, an intrinsic essence that underlies all existence. So matter, ego, consciousness, and spirit kind of shade into each other like different degrees or states of the same thing. Like water can be the water that we drink, but it can be frozen, or it can be a vapor like damp. So the physical world is essentially psychic, and psyche is independent of us. It's objective from the ego's point of view, and we can only know it through direct personal experience of it, through paying attention to our inner experiences, as well as our projections onto the outer world. If we are out of touch with parts of ourselves, we can get those mirrored back to us in the world around us. So ego consciousness is influenced on one end by the instincts, and on the other end, and of course this isn't a two-dimensional thing, but for the sake of ease, on the other end by spirit, which he says he talks about in the form of daimons. So Bernardo Kastrup calls what Jung calls psyche cosmic consciousness, and he says all living organisms, and that includes us, are dissociated alters of cosmic consciousness. So in the same way that any of us can have more than one personality in our conscious awareness, Jung's daimons, he says, are also autonomous dissociated aspects of the collective unconscious, like we are. And Kastrup agrees with Jung that for better or for worse, we can yield control or be taken over by these autonomous psychic forces. So Jung says that daimons are a form and force of consciousness with its own agenda. The Greek word daimon expresses a determining power which comes upon man from the outside, like providence or fate, though the ethical decision about how to respond is left to man. So we always have a choice about how we respond to these forces when we encounter them. The energy underlying conscious psychic life is pre-existent to it. As it approaches consciousness, it appears projected in figures like gods, daimons, etc., whose numen seems to be the vital source of energy. As these supernatural figures fade, the ego seems to come into possession of this source of energy. On the one hand, he seeks to seize it, to possess it, and on the other hand, he's possessed by it. So the daimon would like to inflame you to embrace their work, which is not yours, and you believe that it is you and that it is your work. So just to put these three things alongside each other, according to Jung, we have these personal complexes which are emotionally charged clusters of ideas, memories, and so on around a core element like an early experience, a trauma, a strong desire in the personal unconscious. And this kind of draws material from the personal and the collective psyche in line with archetypal patterning. And these complexes are more or less autonomous, and we register them both in a physical, embodied way, as well as mentally and emotionally. So daimons are personifications of archetypal content in the collective unconscious, and they have an independent, autonomous consciousness and can powerfully affect us. And they're subjects in their own right, with spontaneity and purpose governed by their own laws. And then kundalini is this broad, universal spiritual force that drives individuation towards a deeper connection of ego consciousness with the self, the totality of the psyche. So how is this linked to trauma? Donald Kalshed talks about the archetypal self-care system, and I found this really helpful. So he says early trauma causes our psyche to dissociate or split off unbearable emotional pain to stop our young ego from falling apart. So the most vital, feeling, soulful parts of ourselves get hidden away from consciousness and sealed off from the outside to keep them safe. And that's what gives rise to these archetypally charged trauma-based complexes. So the self-care system really saved us at the time. It's a helpful thing, and it protects us from further wounding. But it may also restrict us when it gets too controlling and makes it harder for us to feel fully alive. And some people experience, for instance, angels as protector figures. They can prevent a similar trauma from happening again, but they can become overly restrictive and punitive, and then that gives rise to these persecutor figures. And they don't have to be figures either. They can be overpowering feelings or moods, or the way that we hold our body as body armor. That can also work in the same way to stop us connecting with parts of our psyche that we've split off and that these figures are protecting, or these processes, I should say, are protecting. So is what links trauma complexes and daimons a shared patterning or resonance? So does our particular wounding, and so our protector persecutor figures, and the nature of our desires resonate with particular archetypally patterned daimons? And so do these complexes and daimons kind of click? Do they mesh and interpenetrate? Jung says that daimons do attach themselves to our complexes and energetically infuse them or light them up. So we become aware of them and then we can integrate them. And he says when a complex resists or blocks the daimon's flow, that gives a kind of friction as the daimon tries to push through. And we can feel that as anger or distress, or as a relentless drive to do something, compulsion. And Jung says we need to resolve the complex and integrate aspects of the diamond as part of the individuation process, and that will then give us a sense of meaning or purpose in life. James Hillman, who is a Jungian, says, well, we can look at that differently as well. We need our wounds and complexes because they're soul-making forces. And actually, how we wrestle with them transforms the complex and shapes our calling or destiny. So the diamonds express themselves through our wounds and complexes as the force for individuation, like water needs banks to become a river, otherwise it's a lake or a marsh. So our task is not to resolve or get rid of our complexes, it's to engage with them and maybe transform them and find symbolic meaning in them. Something can emerge out of the tension between the complex and diamond. And that way of looking at it resonates with what Cynthia Bourgeois calls the law of three, which originally comes from Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, but I haven't read either of those. I've only read Bourgeois. So she says that faced with a problem, we tend to think two-dimensionally in terms of an interplay of opposites like dark, good, evils, and so on. And we try to reach a solution, a stable state, by eliminating one of the poles. But of course, you can't do that because the poles are two sides of an opposition. So they're implied in each other. You can't eliminate or defeat one of them to resolve the opposition. So we end up stuck in an endless two-dimensional cyclical pattern. But if we think in three-dimensional terms, she says the interplay between the two poles, which she calls the first active force and the second denying force, can produce a third mediating or reconciling force, which holds the tension between them. So it doesn't eliminate one or the other, it holds them together. And out of that tension, a fourth thing can emerge, which is a transformative synthesis at a new level. And that's what creates a forward motion because it sets up a new opposition, another triad, a new creative force, and you get this forward movement. New things can arise. And she says this is a really practical thing that you can apply in your life. Whenever you're stuck between two opposing forces in a dilemma, you can free yourself up by looking for the mediating or reconciling third force that brings the conflict into relationship rather than opposition. So thinking again about the complex, blocking the flow of numinous archetypal energy, and I think of that as kundalini, I'll come to that in a minute. And this diagram, this is mine, so I hope I've got this right. This is not Bourgeois. So I've put down the diamond as the first active force, and then the complex or our body armor as the second denying force. And out of the tension between those two comes this energetic flow or information flow that creates this new arising, which could be an insight, a download, meaning, a symbol. So you don't try to resolve the complex away. The diamond needs the complex, our body, our consciousness, to channel the energy coming through. And that then can give us new sense of direction, insight, meaning, and purpose. And Jung talks about the same thing as the transcendent function, the movement beyond the tension between opposites into a new third possibility, a synthesis or a symbol that we hadn't seen before. So I wonder whether if the opposition between diamond and complex, which gives rise to this transcendent function or third force engagement and shift, whether we experience that, because that's all a kind of mental way of thinking about it. And thinking of the opposite side to the coin, might we experience that energetic flow physically as Kundalini? So Chris Beige says that complexes are lodged in the chakras and Kundalini activates the chakras. So it exposes and engages those complexes, and that's what gives a sense of the numinous, the ecstatic energies and insights and experiences that we can have. Dana Swain, our Dana, says that Kundalini is a connection between the ego and self, which is present in the physical body as somatic phenomena, in the psyche as image and feeling. So that's again the physical and the mental. And then on a transpersonal level, as numinous experience resulting in psychological change. That's that third force transcendent arising. Now, Jung talks about the pleroma and abraxas, and neither of these, I think, we can really fully comprehend. The pleroma is like the ground of being, the undifferentiated, still, pure potential for being and nothingness. We can't conceive of that. Abraxas is what he calls the manifest expression of the pleroma. So it's a numinous force, the creative and destructive impulse that's similar to the totality of Shiva and Shakti, and it braces all the opposites. So now this question that I'm asking here comes out of an experience that I'll tell you about in a minute that I had with psychedelics. But so the question is, might the daimon complex pair work in a protective, mediating way, standing between us and abraxas? So humans may not be able to tolerate direct experience of abraxas, and maybe the daimons function as shields or energetic transformers or mediators, downstepping the energy between abraxas and human. And in that way, maybe diamonds humanize or personalize ineffable archetypal energy so that it can impact us in a way that we can actually endure and integrate. And if particular complexes resonate and mesh with specific diamonds, which comes out of our early trauma, and the archetypal patterning that they have in common, might that be why we can feel taken over by those particular diamonds or driven by them as the archetypal energy streams through? And how we engage with those transpersonal universal forces as those diamond complex pairs, is that part of our individuation process, and does that drive us towards our calling or destiny? And so that seems to fit with my experience. So I'm now going to look at how the theory fits with my experience. So I'll give 4 short examples of diamonds in my medicine journeys, and then I'll give you 3 examples from Kundalini experiences that I've had. So this was in 99, a mushroom journey. This relates to that diagram that I gave. I experienced myself as contained in an infinite being, an energy field of love, light, wisdom, knowledge, and infinite compassion. Many people have this experience. I was a reflection or thought within that greater mind, and I saw what seemed to be Christ as a much larger thought form, maybe a diamond, within that field or being. And I could dialogue, it seemed, with this being through Christ as through a portal. And he was one of many such portals. There was Buddha, Muhammad, and many, many beings of immense love, light, and power, which were also reflections and thoughts within this greater field. And Christ seemed to function as a transformer or a bridge between infinite being and my small self. So this is another mushroom journey in 23, which is an example of a more physical, perhaps more classical Kundalini experience. So I was flooded with incredibly powerful waves of energy, and my body was moved into certain positions to help me open to and bear the energy. And I felt completely taken over by a divine feminine being. My question had been, show me the source behind the light, and it was shielding me from that brightness of what felt like a more masculine source. And and numerous times I was seized completely, feeling the energy pour through me. Gosh, it still touches me. It didn't really involve me as my small self. I was incidental to all this happening. I was just a channel. And the blasts of the energy were both terrifying and ecstatic. This was another mushroom journey last year, which was much more mental, um, although also very emotional. It was more waves of light and color, intense pain and grief, and a sense of collective suffering, and having to witness that as part of a healing of the collective. The divine presence here felt much more masculine, and I was drawn into co-creating, or it was creating through me, the most exquisite architecture, temples and cathedrals. It was amazing. And again, throughout, I had a sense of being supported to bear the intensity and power of the experience. So each of these experiences gave a sense of an infinitely powerful, unseen source, a numinous channeling, mediating, and shielding presence between humans and the source, being held in and moved by a vast force that took control of me, and my small self, my ego, being in awe. I was unable to will anything other than a total surrender to this process. The first and the third experience, I felt more of an active part in what was happening. And the first one felt very deeply personal. I felt totally known and accepted and loved. The second experience, as I said, my witnessing self was off to the side somewhere, and all I could do was consent and surrender. It wasn't personal. I was just the occasion for what was happening. This is an ayahuasca journey going back to the late 90s, which was a much darker experience, but I think it still had a similar dynamic. It felt like a numinous entity was trying to take over my body, and I was absolutely terrified. I was literally a whimpering wreck on the floor. I was non-functioning. I was beyond terrified. And it was entering me in different ways. It was contorting my face and my body, engulfing and strangling me. I had a pain in my heart. I was choking. I felt like it was killing me to get my body, and it was trying to take my soul away. And inwardly, I was told I should accept it. But I couldn't do it. I was too afraid, and it felt outside. I couldn't own it as a projection. I just had to wait for the medicine to wear off, and there were these shamans kind of rattling and spitting on me and stuff, but I basically had to wait for the medicine to wear off. So now I'll give you three examples of what feel like illustrations of diamonds as powerful attractors in a process in kundalini journeys, if I can call them those. And for me, times with the energy are a bit like holotropic breath work or spontaneous active imagination. So besides the physical experiences, I have strange thoughts and experiences that seem deeply, powerfully true and meaningful while I'm in them. But I also observe them, and I know that I'm in an altered state. And if somebody rings the doorbell, I can get up and answer the door and be back in my normal sense of self. So this was an experience, and each of these are actually not just one experience. I might have taken like here notes from one particular night, but they extend over a period of days, weeks, sometimes months. So a strong draw to embodying the energy or presence. And I ask for it to replace my core and to let me merge with it. And whenever I ask for that, there is this strong energetic response of the energy kind of coming through. It's exhausting, intense. My back is arcing. Um, And then there is a consistent, strong inner sense of a presence. So I yearn to keep going, ask for it to align me with it, for the connection to become permanent, for help to adjust to it so I can keep functioning in my everyday life. And especially, well, actually, always, but in this particular sequence, I would give anything for it to happen. And I agreed to what felt like a Faustian pact, signing my soul away to the devil to be shown the truth about existence. And I would say that this is probably the only series of Kundalini experiences that spilt over into my waking life. I was actually, during the day, when I was in my normal state of mind, still terrified that I'd signed my soul away to the devil. And it was through reading about Jung and the shadow that I could gradually let go of that. But it was really quite terrifying. Um, so the energy only responds to my complete abandon to the process. I have to completely trust and give myself over to it. So I assume that my narrative of this experience and other experiences is my mind trying to make sense of something that actually is beyond my comprehension. So this is a second series, which is perhaps more physical. It's an experience of ecstatic. It was ecstatic of the presence or energy, and I drinking from one another as though we were one being, and I'm asked to be changed so that we can be one. And I have a sense of being joined at the front of my body along the chakras, um, and the presence entering through the chakras, and I feel myself flowing into the presence, and a sense of mutual feeding, a mutual flow and exchange and abandonment and merger. So there's a deep sense of connection, a sense of a seal or a bond of a contract. And even though I feel repulsed and guilty at some aspects of it, like, I experienced myself gorging at the throat of another, it felt necessary to the process, and I went along with that. And then I felt myself feeding through the whole of my being, and had this sense of mixed up blood and organs. So these experiences seemed aligned with the stories of vampires, and I did wonder whether those stories are actually based on these kinds of experiences, people having them. But alternatively, maybe I'm just trying to conceptualize the experience with reference to myth. This is maybe a more mental example of a Kundalini sequence where I'm again giving myself over, asking to be altered, and I'm being made part of a hive mind, very much like the Borg, actually. I was aware of the Borg in the experiences. So, wave after wave of being held in the energy, bathing in a blissful sense of presence, a sense of this is what I am, and becoming part of another being or entering into another reality and being altered, experimented on by others, taken over. And I gave my will freely for this process, but then it's taken away as I'm joined to the hive. So there are, it seems, parallels between all these experiences and kind of common components of being taken over, fundamentally changed, and joined with something bigger than me that expresses itself through me. So maybe theory did offer a framework for understanding at some level. So you could say that because of early trauma, maybe those terrifying figures and psychic attacks are reflections of complex diamond pairs formed by Kalshet's self-care system. And maybe practices like breathwork, meditation, and psychedelics have increased my archetypal penetrance, which is a term coined by Tim Reed, which means the how permeable the boundary of your ego consciousness is to archetypal material filtering through. So maybe that and spiritual yearning increased the connection or flow between my complexes and diamonds. And maybe that gave rise to these kundalini-like energetic experiences. And maybe there is a transference towards my sense of energy or presence and my longing for connection through merger or being accepted and held in a loving presence is actually a higher octave of my childhood longing for absent parents when I was in hospital. And maybe my anxious attachment to the process and longing to surrender and allowing myself to be adapted and used is a higher octave of trying to earn my parents' love by meeting their needs and expectations. And of course, these human patterns mirror archetypal patterns. So it's quite possible that there is a reflection there. So are these dangers are there dangers in opening to these forces? Claudio Naranjo writes about meditation, psychedelics, and other practices as kundalini activators. And he says they are that because they relax our ego control and body armor so that we can enter these non-ordinary states of consciousness, which open us up to wider and deeper levels of awareness. So we saw the psyche is a continuous field of energy or information with personal and collective dimensions. So when we enter into non-ordinary expanded states of awareness, for instance, through Kundalini activity, we open up to both those dimensions, including the personal shadow and more collective archetypal material. So I'll say a bit about each of those. But first, I wanted to mention ontological shock. So if you're somebody who mostly sees the world through a materialist lens, then encountering the reality and force of the psyche can completely throw you because you have to dismantle and rebuild your whole sense of reality and of who you are. Nothing seems to be what you thought it was. So facing our shadow was one part of what happens when we enter these non-ordinary states. So our shadow, as we saw, includes things we've split off from awareness. So that can be due to trauma, that creates these protector, persecutor figures, but also just our upbringing in the society we live in. We get taught about reality and how things should be, and we push things that don't fit with that away out of consciousness. And the shadow also includes inner conflicts that are hard to acknowledge. For instance, you can love and hate someone at the same time. And most of the time, you deny the fact that you hate them because you want to love them and you're in that kind of relationship. So much of this is charged with archetypal energy. And our task, if you like, is that we need to recover. And the Kundalini can be an occasion for that, a teaching tool, if you like, an opening. We need to recover, feel, and integrate what we can so that these aspects become part of who we know ourselves to be. And we don't have to act on all of it, but we just have to acknowledge that, yeah, that bit of hatred is there, or, whatever the thing is that we don't want to acknowledge. And that way, then we don't have to hold ourselves so tightly in a defense against knowing about those parts of ourselves. So then there's also the encounter with the numinous. And in Kundalini experiences or other non-ordinary states of consciousness, we're steering deep archetypal waters. Our ego consciousness can be flooded by the energies we tap into, or as we see, maybe they tap into us. We may find that there is something beyond our ego that is real and wants to engage and express itself through us, which can be terrifying, can be beautiful as well, but it can be terrifying. And so that triggers a powerful process. And Jung writes about that in his Red Book, his own experiences. And Stan and Christina Groff talk about spiritual emergency, where our everyday functioning ego is overwhelmed by this archetypal content. And the psyche has a dark dimension. There are destructive forces that are intrinsically part of the collective unconscious and of human nature. So diamonds have a light and a dark face. And the numinous has a powerful draw for us. We can be seized and drawn in by this power. We surrender in awe, terror, or rapture. And there is a potential of experiencing what Jung calls an overpowering divine madness. Jung says that this Dionysian intense call to journey and surrender is a call to the self. So it's a normal part and a healthy part of the individual process. But it may take us out faster and further than we can hold or integrate, like a riptide into a field of archetypal gravitational pull. And these experiences can be terrifying, confusing, and disorientating. Jung himself was scared that he would get lost in psychosis. He says, to the superficial observer, the Red Book will appear like madness. It would also have developed into one had I not been able to absorb the overpowering force of the original experiences. And then there is the impact of what we encounter. Paul Tillich, who is a sort of in-between philosopher and theologian, says that meeting these huge, overwhelming, creative and destructive forces in the psyche can trigger a deep fear and anxiety. We can be overwhelmed by what we experience, which may include a sense of our relativity and of death. Our life can feel meaningless and empty in the context of what we saw. Some people kind of enter into a sense of a void. We can feel a deep sense of guilt as we inevitably fall short in our lived lives of the full potential of what we've seen that could be realized through us. So we can come through this and end up living much more fully because of these insights. But when they hit us initially, if we're not prepared for it, that deep existential anxiety can really throw us off balance. So we need to tread carefully. Tillich says we mostly live closed off to the fullness and contradictions of being and hide behind false certainties and a restrictive sense of ourself. And to have those torn away by a sudden overwhelming opening to our depth can blow us apart. So Jung says that entering into states of expanded awareness can be healing and transformative. So, for instance, Kundalini is a beautiful path. It helps us individuate and become more uniquely ourselves, and it helps our ego come more into service to something larger than itself, the totality of the psyche. But it can be hugely disruptive, at least temporarily, of people's lives. And the impact can continue long after the end of like a workshop or a retreat. People go to yoga retreats and get thrown for a period of time until they've worked through what comes up. So people have talked about a kundalini syndrome. When people don't know what's happening and their experiences become overwhelming or distressing, they might try and fight it. And that increases confusion, anxiety, maybe dissociation, and even apparent psychosis. And that can be misdiagnosed and treated in really unhelpful ways. So people are starting to see that Kundalini syndrome is a complex psychological and physiological process that really doesn't fit into the traditional psychiatric models. But we need to prepare and support people better. It's not an easy process, and we need to manage the risk of harm by when we, any kind of workshops or things that may trigger Kundalini, ensuring a good holding environment, the time, a process, and support for people to reflect on the experiences they're having. We need to support people to see the difference between the personal and collective dimensions of the psyche, encourage good self-care, and also for people to keep a balance between a focus on their inner world and our responsibilities in the outer world. And sometimes we can't be in a paid job for a period of time, but maybe there are bits of voluntary work we can do, or we can look after our plants, or there is something that we can do in the outer world to balance the depth of the inner process that's going on. So we're coming near the end of this talk. And before I go into the last section, just a quick recap of what we've said. So far we've looked at things individually, how we can make sense of our experiences. And we touched on ideas about Kundalini and the individuation process, on Jung's notion of complexes and daimons, and Kolschet's thoughts about how trauma can create these protector-persecutor figures. We wondered whether our complexes and transpersonal daimons might mesh in some way because of having a similar trauma-linked archetypal resonance or signature, and also whether these complex daimon pairs might function as an energetic channel for energy, kundalini, as well as being a shield and energetic transformer to protect us from the full numinous force of abraxas, and whether the energetic information flow through the complex diamond pairs might reflect the shift triggered by the transcendent function or third force, and whether we might be experiencing that physically as kundalini. So now I'll briefly look at what might or might not be happening in the collective. So the question is, can we see the impact of the transcendent function or third force as an activation of kundalini on a collective level? So we know that social groups, cultures, societies can carry trauma, and part of a group's awareness can be repressed, and collective complexes can form in its group field. So could those collective complexes also resonate and pair with specific daimons? And could archetypal energy therefore flow into collective awareness? Jung talks about a risk of psychic epidemics when societies are seized by mass movements because of these unconscious energies breaking through. And of course, that also offers a potential for awareness of what is repressed to be integrated into a more balanced culture. Because our Western culture has definitely got very one-sided. We live in a rational, materialist, consumerist world, and we devalue the archetypal feminine and feminine ways of knowing. So maybe the increasing polarities in our world and the unraveling and political shifts we're seeing are actually symptoms of archetypal energy pushing through the blocks of our collective complexes to restore a balance in our culture and in our collective awareness. And could the apparent increase of reports of kundalini-like experiences be a sign of this increased activation of humanity's transcendent function or third force, giving this influx of numinous energy? So Jung does address, he's very concerned with what's happening on a collective level. He writes in the late 50s, early 60s about this, but really what's happening then is kind of happening in writ large at the moment. He says we need to take responsibility for our own individuation. So he comes at addressing it from the individual side. If we can actively engage with the unconscious and embrace the contradictions in our nature rather than disowning them and projecting them, then we can genuinely come to see and engage with other, whether that's other people or nature or the self. We can resist losing ourselves in a kind of group think, these echo chambers and destructive psychic epidemics of looking to leaders or movements or ideologies to save us. And we can live more self-reflectively, true to ourselves, authentically, if you like, and in relationship to the self. And that's what decides for Jung whether, as these energies break through, they destroy us or bring renewal and growth. Cynthia Bourgeault and Irvin Laszlo complement Jung's approach with a more systemic one. So Bourgeault says that we're in transition between two structures of consciousness: a disintegrating mental rational structure, our main Western worldview, in which the collective is seen as a collection or an aggregate of individuals, and our small individual boundaried egos is the functioning unit of consciousness. That's where we think of as consciousness as being based. The information flow is from the part, the individual, to the whole, the group, and focus in this mental rational structure is very much on individual rights. Now, the new emerging structure, as she sees it, in that new structure, the functioning unit of consciousness is dispersed. It's an interpenetrating, diffused, what she calls a witnessing self. And the information flow is from the whole, the collective, to the part, the individual. And the focus becomes the common good. So she says this third force shift, this transcendent function arising of a new solution, is the leap from a focus on individual rights to a focus on the common good. So the way that this works is that systems can develop their own intelligence because of the flow of information between their parts. So the greater the number, complexity, and diversity of relationships, the greater the information flow and the brighter the consciousness within the system. And systemic wisdom emerges fluidly and changes constantly with the situation. It's recalibrating all the time out of this intelligent, flexible listening by that diffused witnessing self, or at that level, to changes within the whole. So it's constantly readjusting. And there's a term for this arising within the system called autopoiesis, however you pronounce that, which is an intelligent, self-regulating, dynamic, purposive whole is emerging in a system. So the common good is the property that emerges from that systemic consciousness in this self-regulating whole, out of the reciprocal feedback between parts and the whole. And individuals can register the common good holographically because the whole is reflected in all the parts. So if we get in touch with that, sensing this systemic wisdom, then that is what gives a sense of coherence and well-being. So we need to trust enough to open ourselves to the depths of the psyche and to listen. And politically, that means listening to the inner knowingness that emerges in individuals because of their resonance holographically with the knowingness in the system. And Ervin Laszlo says something very similar. He talks about the Akashic field. He says that's a universal, subtle, dynamic, formative, non-local, cosmic information field. And it has a systemic, intelligent, and self-organizing wisdom embedded in its structure, which is what gives rise to this evolutionary movement towards wholeness, consciousness, resonance, and coherence. And because smaller complex systems like us holographically contain all the information about the entire field, we can tune into that by intuitively, by stilling our mind and entering expanded states of consciousness. And that could be through kundalini arising. And that gives us a direct experience of how everything is connected and a deep knowledge for how humanity should live. So that's very similar to Bourdieu's common good. And it does seem that more people are opening up to non-ordinary states and experiences, but our Western culture has no container for that. It has no words to think about and share the experiences, and it doesn't welcome them as part of normal human experience. So we need to widen what's called the Overton window, what can be freely shared and talked about in mainstream society. So this is my last slide, and I'm going to finish with a question, really. So if humanity is stuck between competing polarities, might we, through resonant deep listening, possibly occasioned by kundalini, but it could be meditation, it could be yoga, it could be psychedelics, be able to experience Jung's transcendent function, the third force process, and sense there's something new emerging. And is the experience of kundalini the embodied knowing of this emergence, as opposed to the mental side of the coin? Is this the physical embodied side? And do we experience this kundalini and arising in culturally specific ways, physically as an energy flow, mentally as new insights or downloads or symbols, solutions, and relationally as tuning into our daimons as emissaries from the deep psyche or the collective unconscious? And will we trust what speaks to us from the deep? So now it's over to us in our discussion. Does any of this resonate with your experience, and is it how you make sense of things?
That's a lot, Jeanette. Wow, there was a lot in there. So many
I'm
different
surprised.
ideas, and
I hope I didn't go on too long.
no, it was great. Very rich, very interesting. Um, yeah, quite a lot to take in as well, actually. I've been making a few notes about the whole thing, trying to make sure I don't miss anything. But thank you so much. Really, really appreciate that and all the effort that you put into it. It's brilliant. But yeah,
Thank
let's
you.
open it up. Who can answer the question, or who's got a question or a thought or a comment? I mean, my thought at the end was, yeah, Kundalini does feel like the transcendent function, doesn't it? And I kind of subscribe to the Gopi Krishna perspective of, evolution and increasing consciousness, and really Kundalini being the driving force of that expansion of consciousness, um, and that for me sort of fits along that idea of it being, the driving force of the transcendent function, which fits, which is really the Eastern view of Kundalini as well, isn't it? Certainly within Tantra, etc. Kundalini is the creative force which is required to get beyond the dualistic, perspective and experience. So yeah, that's what I thought at the end. Anyway, Darren.
Thank you, Jeanette. That's very interesting. My answer to the question is uh, having learned about the philosophy of the yin and yang, the polarities, it took me a long time to find out there was a third force, which is described as the harmonizing force. And it becomes apparent now to me that it is all about awareness, and that awareness is spent searching for balance. Because without balance, it seems you don't evolve. So that's just a very concise and simple way of my answer to that question. Thank you.
I think that sums a lot of it up. Yeah.
I mean, the other thought that I was having was, about kind of the shadow and the dark and the light and the polarities, and then this third force that's could be the harmonizing thing. I had lots of thoughts about that. One was, again, in Tantra, it's kind of the dualistic perspective of subject object and relationship. So there's, a triangle which is there's you, there's me, and there's a relationship between the two of us, which sounds a bit like the dark and the light and the third force, potentially. It's the you, the me, or the opposites. It's the good, the bad. But there's a relationship between those two because by definition, if there's two things, there's a relationship between them. And that's a kind of dualistic view of the world. And the non and the whole point is Kundalini is working through that dualistic world, as you said, sort of, working through the chakras, working through all our trauma defenses. And when it arrives at the bindo, that subject object collapses. So there is no, the three subject object relationship collapses into one. And that's done away with, which it was striking me that, Jung didn't get beyond dualism. Really, he didn't really get beyond it. And he's wonderful, love him, and he's contributed so much, but he didn't really seem to. Whereas, yeah, the Eastern traditions really, it's kind of all driving towards that. Well, not always, but often it's driving towards that non-dual. That is what Kundalini, the unity of Shiva and Shakti, and yoga unity. Whether you're a Buddhist or whatever you might be, it's ultimately driving towards that collapse of subject object.
I mean, I also had that sense that Jung didn't get beyond duality, but then somebody said, well, yeah, but what about the transcendent function and the symbol that arises out of an apparent opposition? So
Well,
I don't
maybe he
know.
did then.
Maybe he's sort of almost there, but not quite, kind of thing. I don't know. I agree with you. I felt that other other ways of thinking go further, maybe, but I hesitate to.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm no expert, that's for sure. I only,
Nor am I.
know a little bit
Absolutely
about
not.
Jung,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah, there is this, there's what I take from it is like the collective consciousness, and then there's the individual consciousness. Um, and it's a very subtle thing, isn't it? But I guess from a non-dual perspective, there's only one.
yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the difference between staying in the individual and thinking like Laszlo does or Bourgeois, thinking on the level of the collective, and that's one step towards, I suppose, a new non-dual perspective,
Mm.
something that is configured between all of us and joins all of us.
Yeah, yeah. And the last, sorry, I'll stop talking, let other people talk, but just the idea of the shadow and the dark and the light, and what I like about some of the Eastern tantric perspectives is the goddesses embody all the dark and the light, and like Kali being like the epitome of that. She, there's a very dark side as well as a very light side, and the whole point, my take on it is we're all God and God has a shadow, because if he
Yeah,
didn't, we wouldn't have one. He,
yeah,
she, it, whatever you want to call God. But
yeah,
we are consciousness, we are creativity, we are it happening, we are the unfolding, and we have the dark and the light. It's not that there's a sort of, oh, there's a lovely light thing that the likes of Jesus represent, and then there's all this nasty stuff which is not that divine. The divine is
mm,
just this beautiful white light. It's kind of,
mm,
no, it's all one thing. Yeah,
yeah,
which is my experience.
yeah,
I've
yeah,
got a shadow.
yeah. We all have. We all have.
Louisa,
So,
are you there? Are you on
Hello,
mute?
yes, here I am. Yeah, sorry.
Hello.
Thank you very much. Oh, first of all, I just wanted to point out you're still recording.
Oh gosh. What a
Well, you
donut.
can edit that off, can't you? You can chop
Yeah,
it off at
luckily
the
it was
end.
only me. Well, I'm Darren. Don't worry, Darren, we won't put you on YouTube, not even if you want to.